for all you've done to your bodies. It's still real to me, damn it. I mean,
and welcome to It's Still Real to Us. It always pops, Jeremy, so we always wait a few seconds, let him get done with this.
I think it popped Michael as well, didn't it?
It did. Good clip, guys.
So we got the regular cast of characters here with Jeremy Johnson here tonight, JJ, the one that makes it all possible right below me here, Mr. QB1, Randy Cunningham, and tonight we got a very special guest, Mr. Michael St. John. Mr. St. John, I would go over all the accolades you got, but we're going to try to get you out here quick. If I went over everything, we'd be here and wouldn't give you a chance to talk. So, Mr. St. John, thanks for joining us tonight.
Well, please call me Michael. The Mr. St. John goes back to my dad, so just call me Michael, and I'm good with that. But I appreciate you guys having me, and it's always fun to talk about wrestling. You know, wrestling is such a great. I call it a sport. I always have, always will. And it's such a great sport because nothing talks about what creation and life and the world is all about than the history of good and evil and the battle between good and evil. We all battle it. And so they just do it more professionally in the wrestling ring. I've had a true honor to be a part of many associations and work for several promoters. And I've never had a bad experience in wrestling, I must say. It's always been a good experience.
You know, you're one of the few that can actually say that, I think, because usually there's someone that always has a bad experience at some promotion. But, it's great to hear that not everything is as bad as we always hear on all these other podcasts.
Well, not at all. And, it's always easier to talk about the bad stuff. I think that's just human nature at times. And, I worked, to be honest with you, I started out in Memphis, Tennessee, when Jerry Jarrett broke away from Nick Goulas. And before Lance Russell came to work for Jerry, there was about a 4-week period. And 3 of those 4 weeks, I actually did his TV and was live from the Cook Convention Center on 1 week. And it was a great experience and my first experience of doing commentating and play-by-play in wrestling. And then lo and behold, 6 months later, I went to work for Nick Goulas in Nashville and was his on-air commentator throughout this area. I was on the air on 17 markets every Saturday. They'd bicycle the tape around that we would cut live at the Fairgrounds Arena in Nashville on Wednesday night. And then it would be bicycle to Chattanooga and Birmingham and Bowling Green, Kentucky, Louisville, Lexington, Jackson, Florence, Alabama, Tupelo. I know I'm missing some. I don't know if I mentioned Bowling Green, but Knoxville. We're in several markets. In fact, every now and then I'll end up in Chattanooga and people will recognize me despite the gray hair and the mustache. And that is amazing to me. But, I had the opportunity, and I won't call it an honor. It was an honor to follow those 2 men, but to work with Dave Brown and Lance Russell. Worked with Lance when Dave Brown's daughter was killed the night before her wedding by a drunk driver, and was with Lance for about a 8-month period. And then Lance had a heart attack and got to be with Dave for about a year and a half period at the end of the USWA domain in Memphis, and working for Nick Goulas. Harry Thornton had a heart attack, and Harry had been the longtime commentator on Channel 12 in Chattanooga, besides doing the morning show at WDEF radio. And I had to go in and sub in for him on those Saturday tapings at 11 o'clock Chattanooga time, which was 10 o'clock in Nashville, which meant we left Nashville at 7 o'clock in the morning, and Nick Goulas drove 105 miles an hour in a Continental down the middle lane of I-24. And the police would look at him and they'd wave at him and he'd wave back and they'd keep going. So that was an experience, and had some time to work and ride with some of the boys as well. So that was sort of my beginnings of my commentating career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I read a little bit about you. You started out here in Huntsville, or close by here in Huntsville. How did you get from Huntsville up to Memphis?
Well, okay. And my radio career started when I was actually 15 years old. MD Smith, who owned Channel 31 and Way Radio at the time, and I was a cashier at the Bruno's supermarket over on at the Parkway and University, and he used to come through my checkout lane. And one night I was making announcements in store for some produce special or something. He heard me and came through my line and asked me, he said, have you ever thought about being in radio? Well, that's what I really wanted to do with my life. I found my calling earlier on. And he gave me my first opportunity at Way Radio. And then I went off to college and I ended up at Vanderbilt for 4 years and graduated from there and sort of ran the campus radio station and worked for some radio folks up there for WMAK and Scott Shannon. And I just had a good, I was lucky. I just was able to follow some good leads and went to Memphis. I was actually after my college, after I graduated, I went to work in Birmingham at ERC and what became Kicks 106 and was programming the FM down there and got an opening to go to work in Memphis at WMPS. And that's when I got introduced to my afternoon guy at WMPS was a guy named Ron Jordan. He was good friends with Jerry Lawler. Lawler was good friends with Jackie Fargo. And they all worked for Jerry Lawler or for Jerry Jarrett, as it turned out. And I got sort of like, I won't say thrown in, but asked to join because Lance was still at Channel 13. Dave was still at Channel 13. They had left Channel 13 and gone on Channel 5. Channel 5's sports director was the announcer the first week. And as Jerry Lawler told me in the dressing room the first night I was there, he said, you can't be any worse than that guy. He was the drizzling shits. And so that's sort of how it started out. And then when I ended up back in Nashville running Kicks 104, I lived about a half a mile from where Jerry Jarrett's house was in Hendersonville. And, I knew Jerry from before, and then West, his camera guy, they started shooting a lot of videos. The Hulk Hogan video was one, the Fabulous Ones, Kamala Giant, and several others, and they needed a voice. And despite I have one of the worst radio voices in the history of radio, they decided to use me. So that ended up on the Hulk Hogan video, and I laugh about it. In fact, when Jerry passed away, I was at the funeral, and his wife and I were laughing about it in line. That video has been shown over 10 million times on the various video sources of him posing and the guy saying, "Dan, that's my voice." And Jerry paid me for it. He paid me $25. So people you should, aren't you mad that you didn't get paid more? No, because that's what he paid me for all of them. I was happy, $25. So that's sort of what bubbled up. And then all of a sudden, after Memphis, I had several situations. I was the first wrestling commentator for Jerry Jarrett on ESPN in Dallas after he bought the WCCW from the Von Erich at the auditorium, and rode or flew down to Dallas for innumerable weeks every Friday, did the show, got on the bus, which was Waylon Jennings' tour bus. We drive overnight with the boys and the ladies for that matter to Memphis. And then we get into Memphis about 7 o'clock in the morning, and that show started at 11. And then after the show, Jerry Jarrett or Ed Garland would be there. They would have driven down from Nashville, and I'd just ride home with them. So from 12:30 on Friday until 3:30 on Saturday, I was a road warrior, if you would. So I've had a lot of great opportunities.
Wow.
So did you actually sleep any during that time?
You know what's funny, and I tell this story, and it's a true story. Steve Austin was on that bus, and Steve was a young guy. He had blonde hair. He had a young lady he was dating that was one of the wrestlers, and he and Tojo made sure that I got sleep. And sometimes they wouldn't get sleep, but they gave me the back bunk, the very back bunk of the bus, up on the top. And if anybody started to go back there, they'd stop them. Hey, leave St. John alone. He's got to put us over tomorrow. He's got the best job in the business. And so they protected me. We would stop at about 3:30 in the morning at the Flying J in Texarkana. And it was a potty break, basically, and a beer run for the rest of the boys. And I'd get off the bus, and before I get off, Tojo, and he would not go because Tojo kept kayfabe sold to the day he died. But he would stay on the bus, and he'd say, Miss St. John, give me pork rinds, get me cracklings. So I'd get him a big bag of cracklings, and that would be what he would eat the rest of the trip. And again, some unique times to say the least.
Yeah, me and you, our careers kind of went side by side there. People's asked me about being on radio, not because of my voice, but because of my face. But that's a whole different story.
Pretty much the case here, I can assure you, especially.
Randy Cunningham, I want to let you take over, my friend.
Yeah, I was one of those kids in Chattanooga that grew up on Harry Thornton and do remember you from Goulas Wrestling and lived in a situation where I got Memphis and Chattanooga. So I want to ask you one thing about to start with, in that you already alluded to it, the Hulk Hogan vignette, but they're also a very famous vignette with Kamala. Were you just the vignette guy when they wanted a voiceover? They called Michael St. John.
Yep, that was the case. Our radio station, we started a station called Kicks 104 in Gallatin in 1978. We lived in Hendersonville. We had our sales office in Nashville because we were 100,000 watt FM. We had our programming office and the business office out in Gallatin on 109, on Highway 109 North, between Gallatin and Portland. And I lived in Hendersonville, which was the halfway mark. And our sales manager and I, we had a one owner, one operator situation. He was a great guy that lived in Ronnie Bledsoe, and he had Tex live in Hendersonville. Michael lived in Hendersonville, and he'd bring up the tapes of the commercials that were going on in the air, and then I'd bring him any paperwork, and we'd meet every night and swap that. And I was living on Bonita Parkway, which is the backside of Cumberland Hills Drive, which was where Jerry Jarrett lived. Well, in front of Jerry Jarrett was Randy Westhouse. Randy was his son-in-law, and also his head camera and promoter, or not promoter, but his head market guy. And Randy would just call me, and I was literally less than 5 minutes away, and he'd call me and say, "Hey, is there any way you can come over to the house tonight about 7:30? We need to do these VOs, or we need to do these promos, or we need to do this or do that." And I was like, "Sure." So I'd go over, and Randy and I spent some fabulous time together and got to be good friends to this day. And that's sort of how it happened. It was a convenient, I was a voice that was convenient and cheap. So why not?
I've got a couple of clips that kind of follows that line. And I would just like to show you a couple of quick clips. Won't run all of them, and get what you remember about it. And the first one is my favorite segment I ever think you were on. And I'll just run a minute of it. But Dutch Mantell is very upset that you're doing color.
Michael came down from St. Louis, if you want to know. He drove down from St. Louis.
He came down from...
And we, as a guest in here today, we're just having him sit right there, and that's all.
Where did you
He's
think
driven all the way from St. Louis to
Where did you
here.
think I drove from? Across the street? I drove down from Nashville. He drove down from St. Louis. I drove, too. I drove a long way, too. Oh. And I want to know...
Wait a minute. This is... Lance, I'll just leave. Michael, sit down. Hey, sit down.
Wait a minute.
Now, Dutch is down here running the show.
Hey, one of my favorites. Remember it to the day. And when we heard you were going to be on, I immediately thought of that segment.
Remember that segment? Yeah, Dutch was healing it up right then and there, and I think it was more of. I often accused him of shooting more than working, although we were working. But and I still think he was shooting because he ended up on dark side of the ring and I didn't. But nobody called me. And I had done it a lot cheaper. But that was at that particular time was the time that David had the tragedy with his family, and I was coming down from St. Louis. I was operations manager of the Zimmer stations in St. Louis, and was coming down. And my favorite part of that is remembering that I could make it pretty quick because I just bought a brand new 1996 Mitsubishi GT 3000 GT. And that booger would run. And between Cape Girardeau and West Memphis, it was pretty clear sailing. So you could make some good time. But you know that that was a segment that ended up, a lot of people look at that segment because it, again, Jerry Jarrett, to all his credit, he wrote and produced segments and did programs with the wrestling shows that were about human beings and personal issues. And Jerry had a sign in his office, and I'll never forget it. I can still see it to this day, that said, "Personal issues sell tickets," or "Personal issues make money." And indeed it did. And that was, it was a personal issue for Dutch. It was a personal issue for me. And, we did what we did. And that was funny. But I still to this day think Dutch was shooting more than he was working in that one.
Dutch is an incredible personality and a great speaker. So I've always had a lot of admiration. This next segment is the first time I saw these two future WWE Tag Team Champions on TV, was with you. And I believe this is from Memphis Championship Wrestling. And let's run a little bit of it.
About the match, the Hardy Boys are a mystery no more in the world of professional wrestling. The latest signees in the WWF, Jeff and Matt Hardy. It's great to have you in MCW.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here in MCW. I want to thank everybody out here that's been rooting and cheering for the Hardy Boys through the hard years. But now it's time for a change, and the nascence of the Hardy Boys has just begun. Matt and Jeff Hardy will rejuvenate tag team wrestling for the millennium. The Hardy Boys will have these fingers crossed from now to the end of the next millennium, and we will continue to rack up win after win.
Wow.
That was the first time I saw the Hardy Boys. Did you know? Did you see what was going to happen in the future with them?
That's the first time I've seen that clip, other than when I did it. And I barely remember having them and an opportunity to work with them. But, the thing about those guys is they had a lot of talent, and they could make a promo. And it was no surprise that, you could see, you normally after, and I had been around the business at that point about 20 years. And you start to see, you could see talent, and you could see green talent, and you can see green talent that's going to bronze out. And then you can see green talent that's going to go away. And there were several folks in that short-lived promotion that, went on to become, stars in the business. And those guys, I knew by their work in the ring, and I knew by their work on the mic, and seeing them early on, that they were going to go places. Again, I had a chance to work with Eddie Gilbert when he was just starting out. And you knew with Eddie, and Eddie behind the scenes was such a very kind person. I mean, I remember the day that we found out that Eddie had died. It was a very, him and the loss of Tojo were the two that I actually cried when I heard that it happened, because I'd gotten to know them personally as well as in the ring. And they were such wonderful talent. They were such great talents. And, but you sort of get to know people, and you think, well, these guys are going to make it, or these guys have a chance, and then this guy's not going to make it. And I'm not saying I'm batting 1,000, but you pretty much can tell.
Jeremy, I'll come to you after this follow-up. In that same promotion, you had a young man that I thought was bound to be a superstar. Got a couple of runs in WCW. I actually think he held the NWA title for a little while. The Colorado Kid, who at the same time maybe was more heralded than the Hardy Boys, but he never broke through that national success. What was it the microphone? Was it because they could all wrestle?
Well, the style of wrestling, that period of time we're talking about, the style had begun to change. And, the WWE sort of became the proponent of change when they became the national power. And the change I'm talking about is boys went from learning in the streets, literally learning on the road, working every night, making horrible money, but getting a ton of, sometimes you can make terrible payoffs, but get $1 million in schooling. in education. And the wrestling business, I think, is a very good example of that. And the wrestling was beginning to change. So Colorado Kid, I think, he just didn't have that extra little it factor. And that was the thing that was going over at that time. And then, it went from being a wrestling on the mat, kind of a mat laden ring and a mat laden match, to becoming, the flying trapeze that we have today. And I think that was about the time there was a little transition. So, I think Colorado Kid was a talented person that had a chance, but for whatever reason that, may have gotten caught in the cracks. And that's
5 years before, the Colorado Kid is all over every network. I think, he really reminds me of that star of the early 80s.
Oh yeah, I'm aware of that. But again, that's like the guy that was Shawn. What's his last name with Generation X? Not Shawn Michaels, but the I'm sorry,
Waltman.
Yeah. And to me, he got the push because of Triple H. And he sort of got in on the wave as it was, starting to roll up the shore with Triple H and the D-Generation X. And of course, Shawn Michaels, one of the greatest talents of the professional wrestling business in the last 100 years. He sort of rode that crest and rode that wave. And there were a lot of athletes that just didn't have that opportunity or got that push.
Well, I'll turn it over to one of the voices of Five Football on Fun Radio, Jeremy Johnson.
Well, let's just be clear. Adam Ward is the voice of the Five Red Devils, and he's second. He's second to none, in my opinion. We just show up and have a good time and try to add a little entertainment value, maybe. But along that line, and you were talking about folks that maybe hit at the right time or whatever. Is there somebody that you think back throughout your wrestling experience? Is there somebody you feel like they were extremely underrated? They should have made it. They had everything. They didn't hit that wave at the right time. Michael.
Well, there's there's a couple of wrestlers that do come to mind that were the Missouri, the guy that we call the Missouri Mauler out of St. Louis, Jeff Gaylord, the Missouri Tiger, the Missouri Mauler. I think he comes to mind right away because he had it all. He could do a good promo. He's a good-looking guy. He was well built. He was well maintained, and it was a situation where he could have gone further, but he partied a little too hardy. Not to throw shade on the Hardy Boys, but he partied a little bit too much, and got on the juice, and he wanted to be bigger. I look at The Rock. I look at Dwayne now, and I worked with Dwayne right after he got out of college at the University of Miami. I saw him play his last football game against Alabama in the Sugar Bowl in '93. And then 3 years later, I guess it was, I was working with him, and he came in as Flex Cavana, and they tried him as Rocky Johnson Jr., and that didn't work. And then he was Flex Cavana, and he was a big, well-built guy. But I see him today. Oh my goodness. I mean, but again, and I know he's probably taken the juice. I have no doubt. But the difference is that he's been in the hands of professional trainers now, certainly all of his acting career, and even before that in the WWE. So they knew what to do, where to go, how to do it to make him bulk up without destroying his kidneys or killing his brain. So, that's a thin line, but Jeff Gaylord comes to mind right away. That just could have been the next world champion. Chris Champion is another one that I worked with that I thought Chris had all all the everything you needed to be successful in the business, and he just sort of went off the rails. And in his situation, he got hurt. He started taking painkillers, kept taking painkillers. Even after the pain subsided somewhat, he was still taking painkillers, and it sort of derailed him. And he was another one of those folks that I think had stardom written all over him. And the last one I'll mention is Brian Christopher. He got to that point, to a certain point. But I always thought, and Jerry Lawler is a friend of mine, and I think the world of Jerry and would do anything for him. But I always thought Jerry, in trying to be helpful to Brian, held Brian back, not because of anything he was doing intentionally, but Jerry didn't want Brian's name associated with the Lawler name. And you look at some of the athletes, you look at the Von Erichs. I mean, it's a tragic family, but I mean, it was a family name that you said Von Erichs and you knew they were great wrestlers. Greg Gagne was a good wrestler, a better promoter, but a good wrestler. You look at the Kurt Hennig, he's Larry Hennig's son. I mean, and there's a ton that we could talk about that sort of, they didn't necessarily ride their father or their family's coattails, but because they were exposed to it from the time they came out of the womb, developed into great wrestlers. And I thought Brian Christopher was that way, but and Jerry trying to not shun him, but shun him on TV and not let anybody know, hey, that's my son. Number one, I think Jerry didn't want anybody to know his real age, and he certainly never looked it, and to this day doesn't look it. And then I think the other thing was that he didn't want any of his shine to hurt or to help Brian, because he wanted Brian to stand on his own 2 feet, which as a dad, I understand that. As a grandfather, I understand that. But I think that Brian Christopher could have been as big as Jerry Lawler had there been some different circumstances.
Awesome. Follow up for me. I don't have a ton of questions, Michael, but for me, could you pinpoint, and I know there's probably multiple moments, a memorable thing, moments that's happened. Could you kind of talk about maybe one of your most fond wrestling moments? You know, something that you think about regularly, or it's just always stuck there in your memory.
Well, working with the Super Clash was amazing. Working when they unified the world title, and we did it in Dallas, and we did it in Memphis, and we did it in Nashville, we did it in Louisville, we did it in Evansville with Lawler and Kerry. Awesome moments. My 2 favorite moments, believe it or not, first one was both with Harley Race, who I personally think, in my humble opinion, is the greatest wrestler of all time. No disparaging to Ric Flair. I think Ric Flair was the greatest personality in wrestling of all time that could both wrestle and work. Hulk Hogan was a great personality. Hey, between you and I, Hulk Hogan couldn't work. So, I mean, I just think that, you know, Flair is, and he still has that moxie and that charisma. But Harley Race, number one, he was a tough SOB. I mean, when you met Harley, he was the nicest guy in the world, treated you like royalty. My son at the time was 4 years old, took him in the dressing room. I've got a picture with Nick Lewis and Harley Race and my son Christopher in the belt, and I wouldn't give $1 million for. Harley was a tremendous competitor, but we had Harley in a match in Nashville against George Goulas. And Sam Munchnick, who I got to know when I was in St. Louis toward the end of his days, talked about it. And Sam was not happy because the idea with the NWA's heavyweight champion is every one of the territories would get him for a week in the year. And then there were 28 territories. And then the rest of the time he'd do Japan, he'd do shots on like the Georgia Championship, whatever the case may be. Got very little time off. But Harley was just a road warrior, literally, and came to Nashville. And in fact, I think Dutch was working with us at the time. And I think Dutch probably would have deserved that shot at the world title, because when the world champion came to town, the idea was there wasn't going to be a belt turn, but he was going to shine your best baby face, or he was going to shine your best moneymaker. And George went to Daddy and ended up in the match with Harley, and it went 60-minute Broadway. And I don't have a copy of that, and I would love to have it, because I really think that was my best work on the microphone, because I had to fill 60 minutes. And Harley, and I think that was George Goulas's greatest match he'd ever wrestled and ever will. And Harley carried it, and it was Harley's match that he, you know, I think Dutch was the one that started the rumor that, you know, George is in there chopping Harley, and he's saying, "Daddy says sell, Daddy says sell." I never heard that. I mean, it could have happened. I'm not saying not, but I never heard that. And I was right at the table. And a couple of times there's one time I remember in the match, Harley came over to our table. I'm standing there with the bell, and he's working the ring, working the crowd. And the crowd, you know, when it started all was very lukewarm. It was a sellout at the Fairgrounds Arena. It was very lukewarm. And then as George got a little more, you know, a little bit more up on the match in Harley, there were people toward the last 10 minutes of the match that thought George Goulas was going to upset Harley Race in that crowd. And I can remember we were about at the 30-minute mark, and Harley comes over and he's working the crowd, and he would put his hand on my microphone. I had a stick mic. He put his hand on the microphone, and he says, "How much damn time have we got left?" And I went, 30 minutes. And he said, "Thank you." And it continued. But at the end of the match, George gets screwed. Harley gets the win. We're leaving. Harley has to have the 4 Nashville police officers come to surround Harley. And I've got to go back to the back to do a post-match interview for the TV bicycle tape that's going to go to the other cities in the dressing room immediately after the match. And I'll never forget, we were just left the ring area. We were just past the ringside seats. And this gentleman in overalls, about 5'5", scraggly fella, came out of the crowd towards Harley. And Harley was left-handed, and he came at Harley off the left-hand side. I'm right behind him. And I see the knife about the same time Harley sees the knife. And he was going to stab him. And he was coming right at him, and the cops were, you know, they froze for a moment. But as he came forward, Harley took his right hand and caved that guy's jaw in. I mean, right in front of my face, caved the man. That's the side of his jaw went from one side to the other side of his face. And we got back to the dressing room. Of course, the police, they got more police over there, and there was a big rubble. And then that took the heat off Harley and got us back in the dressing room. We get back to the dressing room. And Nick said, "What happened? What happened?" And Harley tells him what happened. And Harley is shaking like a leaf. I mean, he's shaking like he's had some kind of palsy. And he looks at me and he says, "Hey, kid, can we wait a few minutes for this?" He said, I gotta get my bearings. I said, "Mr. Race, you tell me when." But that was an episode that will never, I've never been that close to anything like that. Thank God. But that could have turned out disastrous. But and Harley was a left-handed fighter and a left-handed person, and he took that right hand and he threw that short jab. And I mean, I was petrified as to what was happening. But then when I saw the reaction of Harley and what he did, it went from being, whoa. I mean, it was one of those things. But that's something that I will always remember. And the last thing, sort of the saddest thing, is I was in St. Louis. I was programming 8:30 in the morning. I get a phone call from my wife, and then my secretary comes in and says, "Michael, your wife's on the phone." And normally that's bad news. And that day it was in January of 1992, and I was told that Tojo Yamamoto had committed suicide. And I lost it. I mean, that I'll never forget. Tojo was one of those people I started working with immediately, and I worked with him literally all through that period of time. And as we got to know each other as a person, as a wrestler, as a mentor, Tojo one of these people. I mean, you talk Tojo Yamamoto in the South and people go, oh, that mean Jap, you know, blah, 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 blah. But he worked, not only did he work with me as an announcer, and he would tell me, you don't say that, you don't say that, you say this way, and that kind of thing. But he also took the boys under his wing. And the Freebirds, you showed the shot with Terry Gordy. Terry Gordy was 16 years old when I called his first match in Nashville, Tennessee. And he got juiced by the Sheik, who, again, one of my favorite wrestlers. People think I'm crazy because I liked Zeb, and we spent some fun times on the road. And he was a brilliant man and had a heart of gold. And anyway, the Sheik, Terry, he had that pencil. And he came after that. The Sheik had what is called a grease pencil in the broadcast world, and it's basically a white wax and a white crayon, if you would, and you would mark your tape to edit, to take the uhs or the mistakes or whatever out of. And he would take that and he'd take a gig and push it down in that white wax and put it in his boot. And when he pull it, there was about, not even 1/10 of an inch of the gig showing out. But and the boys would know it was coming, but he would juice them. But the way he would do it is he would make it look like a worse one than what it was, but it would be no different than the boys doing it to themselves. But Terry was very young, and Terry, instead of leaning back when he came at him with the pencil, went forward, and the thing stuck in his head. And this is in the Nashville Fairgrounds Arena. And as the Sheik backs up, there was this horrified look on Ed's face, and Gordy's got this pencil sticking in his head, and he pulls it out himself. And when he does, it's just a gusher. I mean, he walked into it. So instead of just getting the skin, he got a good 1/4 inch, maybe even further into his skull. Well, they shortened the match. They went to the finish quickly. We got him back to the dressing room, and they can't stop the bleeding. So he's 16 years old. He's working illegally because he's supposed to be 18 to have a license in Tennessee. He's got a license, wrestler. And Nick or George, they're like, how are we going to get him to the hospital? We got to get him to a hospital. We got to get him to the hospital. And there was no doc in the boxes back then around. So guess who got to take him to Vanderbilt Hospital? I said, well, if I'm taking him, I'm taking him to Vanderbilt because I have as having graduated from there and so forth and so on, I've actually got a little identification card. And when you're there, they treat you as a whatever. So anyway, and I'd worked at the hospital for a semester when I was in college. So long story short, got him over there. He's shaking out like a leaf and about to pass out. Terry Gordy is a big guy. And Michael Hayes is in panic mode. But Michael Hayes isn't worried about Terry losing the blood and passing out as much as they're going to get arrested because they're 16 and 17 years old and wrestling in Tennessee without a license or with a license that isn't legit. So that's an old story. But we got Terry patched up and got him back to the hotel over on Murfreesboro Road. And before he died, I had a chance to work with him over in I want to say, is it Redan, Georgia? It was over in the Atlanta area, over by Gwinnett County. And I got to work with him a month or two before he died. And he was not in good shape then, but he remembered that situation. He said, at 16, you probably saved my life. I said, no, at 16, I probably saved your career because you didn't get caught for not having a wrestling license in Tennessee, and we laughed about that. Those are some stories. I mean, I'm starting a book. I'm hopefully going to find a ghostwriter because trying to do it yourself and do everything I do, I'm not finding much time to really write it. But I've written a lot of memories down and a lot of thoughts down, and not only about wrestling, my wrestling side of things, but my radio career as well. And I've been honored. I'm in the Alabama Broadcasting Hall of Fame. I'm in the NWA Wrestling Hall of Fame's announcer division. I'm being inducted into the Memphis Wrestling Hall of Fame in September. And when I get word of this, I tell my wife, I said, well, I must be closer to death, and they're wanting to get this all done before I that's sort of where that's coming from. But
Oh, great stories, Michael. I could listen for hours.
Well, thank you. The thing about it is people ask me all the time, is wrestling fake? Well, no, wrestling is not fake. But now, if you ask it in a different way, and the way things have turned out since the WWE and Vince telling people it was a show and all that, the boys always protected the product back in the day. And I can tell you from times like the stories that I just told you, there's no fake in Terry Gordy having the Sheik's pencil stuck in his head. And I was doing a wrestling match early on in Birmingham at the Boutwell Auditorium, and the Kangaroos were wrestling Don Green and Bearcat Brown, and that was one of the first matches I did for Nick out on the road on a Monday night. And Don Kent from the Kangaroos went for a shoulder. He had his opponent. He had Al Green in the corner, and he went with his shoulder to give the shoulder to Al in the midsection, and Al turned away. Well, it was called that way, but Kent couldn't stop his momentum, and his shoulder went into the ring post at full run, at full force, and he broke his shoulder. And so he's working, and Al Green immediately Don Green recognizes it, and anyway they tag out, and Costello comes in, and they had a quick finish because of the injury. Pat Malone was the referee, and Pat, of course, went over and told Al Costello what had happened, and Al knew it already. So to tag out, and they get a quick DQ on the Kangaroos, and they help. We get back to the dressing room, and Don Kent's shoulder is the size of a basketball. And so there's been some times I've seen boys get hurt, and it's not a pretty sight. But the difference today and then, if I can sort of close this up on that, is that back then, all the wrestlers, girls and boys, men and women, protected each other. I don't care how big the heel was. The Sheik was probably one of the biggest heels in the history of the world, or Abdullah the Butcher. They protected even when there's juice, they protected those boys in the ring. And in this day and time, the one thing that has changed is, back then, and Jimmy Cornette has the best quote in the world. Back then, it was quote unquote all planned out and nobody got hurt. Now, it was all a work and nobody got hurt. Now, a lot of it's a shoot to make it look real and everybody gets hurt. So I don't know if I got that quote exactly right, but Cornette, I think, is right on the money with that. I also had the honor, you mentioned a story, and I'll just quickly, in Chattanooga at Channel 3, I had the honor of being the first commentator that Jimmy Cornette ever worked with as a manager. And he says, he gave me a great compliment years ago on this podcast. He was talking about that 4-week. It was the 4-week run with Jerry Jarrett and Ole, where they were working together and going to share talent and create this East Tennessee, Northern Georgia territory that was going to be the best all end all. Well, one week you'd go into the studio and it looked like Memphis Championship Wrestling at Channel 3, or it looked like Memphis Wrestling with just the curtains and a desk and a logo. And the next week you go in there and there'd be spotlights and disco balls, and it looked like Georgia Championship Wrestling. So they never could agree. But when we did the segment with Terry Taylor and Bobby Fulton, and Fulton gets blinded, and Terry Taylor's over the top looking at him. Jimmy says it looks like the biggest gay porn shot in the history of wrestling. And the whole shot that had any credibility was Michael St. John. And I'm like, well, thank you. So anyway, that's just a little sidebar on my buddy Jimmy. Great guy.
Yeah, we're all big Jim Cornette fans on here. We listen to his podcast all the time, and I'm not Jeremy. I can sit here and listen to you talk about this stuff hours at a time, just like I can listen to Jim Cornette as well, talking about the old days, and you talking about getting out of there with Harley Race, and possibly getting stabbed and all that. That it was a little bit before my time, but man, I wish I could go back and see all that stuff in person myself.
Well, my buddy David said, it's real to him, and you guys say it's real to you. That nothing about that wasn't real. And so it can be very real.
Right. You mentioned the Von Erichs a little bit earlier. Was you able to see the Iron Claw movie?
I have seen the Iron Claw movie, and I think it was, of all the wrestling movies that have been done that I've had the opportunity to see, I think it's the one that they did the best job telling the story, although they took liberties. And
Hmm.
but at the same time, it's a movie, and I think they did a very good job of the movie. And it really, it really, I left the theater. It's To me, I left the theater thinking, "Damn, that's depressing."
Yes.
These guys could sure have had a better life and a better world, but I'm telling you, when I went to Dallas, when Jerry first took over Dallas, and I went that first time, I flew to Houston from Nashville because you couldn't fly Southwest direct to Dallas. They had the Wright Amendment back then, so I had to fly to Houston, run the length of Hobby Airport, get a puddle jumper, which every half hour at Southwest had a flight going to Houston or from Houston to Dallas and vice versa, and I'd get in Dallas at 4 o'clock. They pick me up in a car and go to the production meeting. And then I had about an hour and a half, 2 hours of free time. And the Sportatorium was a $5 cab ride from downtown Dallas. So I'd go down, maybe do a little shopping, grab a bite to eat, and then go back and be ready for the show by 6:30. But the first time I went over the Sportatorium, I walked in the building and it looked so much bigger and nicer on TV because it was a dump. And the floor, you got to remember, it's a church at one time back in the 30s, and the floor was at an angle going down to the ring, and you only had fans on three sides of the ring, but they only shot where it didn't look like but three sides of the ring. But there was literally a wall that had the ESPN, not that ESPN banner. I've got the ESPN banner that came off the wall of the Sportatorium because we did the last show there ever. And I took the old ESPN banner. It's upstairs framed, but anyhow, the thing that got me is, imagine this, guys, the smell of buttered popcorn and cigar smoke. That could be a candle, but I'm telling you, that's what the Sportatorium smelled like. But it was in the back. The boys, most of them were messed up before they got, not Jerry's crew, but the Dallas crew. Most of them were messed up before they ever got there, and they continued to recreationally indulge all during the show.
Yeah.
Hey, no, I'm
Go ahead,
sorry,
Jeremy.
Harry.
No, go
So,
ahead.
so along the line, I just wanted to. This is how he asked you about the movie itself. I have to ask, what was your impression of the Ric Flair character in that movie?
They could have got Flair. I mean, he could have pulled it off. That was a little, there's also a scene in that movie that it's Jerry Jarrett talking to Fritz, talking to Jack Atkinson, and they only show his back. And I think they could have gotten that explanation over a little bit better, and it may have ended up on the cutting room floor. Who knows? I'm not the author of it, but I did feel like the movie was, on a grade of 1 to 10, I would give it an 8, only because it told the story. It wasn't actually correct, but it told the story.
Yes. I
Yeah,
agree with that.
I kind of laughed when you said, you left and talked about how depressing it was, because you basically said the same thing. We all three went and saw it at the same time, and you basically took the words right out of our mouth what we said when we was leaving as well. And that's why I was laughing, because it was not because it was depressing. It's just your mindset was the same as ours.
Well, our thoughts were, it's like, man, that's depressing. And I think one of us finally said, man, that Ric Flair actor was terrible.
Oh, I'm I movies that are about, biographies, or movies that are about things that truly did happen. If you weren't there, you could be very critical of them, or if you were there, you could be very critical of. If you weren't there, you're taking it for face value. But I really thought, when WCCW, when the Dallas boys came into the USWA, some of them that had talent and had good common sense. And Steve Austin is number one on that list. Jackie, the woman wrestler, Miss Texas, another one on that list. I mean, they saw the light, and they took a lot less money from Jerry Jarrett, but then look where they got in their career because of it. And I'm not saying Jerry was a bad pay, but he sure didn't. If you made him money, he paid you well. If you were just on the card and wasn't drawing money, and you were just there to be there to fill in the card, you got paid minimalistically. And so, again, I think the boys that followed Jerry's philosophy and learned from, and Jerry's, the people behind Jerry Jarrett's wrestling were Jerry Lawler and Tojo Yamamoto, Bill Dundee, to a little lesser extent, Buddy Wayne. They were guys that they had drawn money in their own lives and knew how to do it. And then if you could talk it, Jerry Lawler's probably one of the best interviews in the history of wrestling, and Lawler would help them with their promos. And so you take the people that listen to that, look where they went in life. Another one is my friend Jim Morris, Hillbilly Jim. If you read his book, he was very kind to me in the book. I met Hillbilly Jim. Kicks 104 was the number one radio station, despite that we were 40 miles away. We're the number one radio station in Bowling Green. We went up there to do a live Thursday night event at the bar, and it was a live remote, and I was the air talent for whatever reason, and he was the bouncer at the door, and we got to talking, and he even recognized me from being on wrestling. He said, "Man, I've always wanted to be a wrestler." So he said, "How did I get into it?" I said, give me your name and your phone number, and let me give it to Tojo, and then talk to Tojo. Well, he and Tojo got together, and then next thing you knew, he was wrestling as Harley Davidson for Jerry Jarrett, and then went on to New York and became Hillbilly Jim. And again, big guy, talented guy. I'm not saying he could work that great, but had a great gimmick and could talk it and got better at it. And, Jim's retired and a multimillionaire that owns 3 concrete plants in Southern Kentucky, and get to talk to him every now and then. And I mean, he's done some consultant work for the WWE. At one time, he was heading up all the DVDs and the anthologies and all that you would see produced by WWE Entertainment. Jim Morris was in charge of that. And so, again, the boys that had good common sense and could see the difference between, I can have a good time now being a wrestler, or I can sharpen my talents, do what they tell me to do, because maybe I can be even bigger. Those guys and ladies were successful and continue to be successful in their careers.
Good deal. We've kept you a long time, Michael.
Let's do it again. This has been fun. I like this. This is sort of hot seat wrestling. I like that.
If you don't mind, let us go around and ask one more question, then we'll let you go. Is that okay? You have time for that?
Absolutely.
My question is going to be, and then I'll come to you, Randy. My question is going to be, do you still follow wrestling today?
I do, mainly because I love to keep up with most of the boys I've worked with now are getting older, but I'm seeing their sons, and in one case their daughter, and I'm enjoying that. But I do a wrestling show and have been for the last 3 years with my good friend Randy Hales, who was the booker for Jerry Jarrett for a long time. We do a podcast on Tuesday night for 2 hours called Talking Memphis Wrestling. And it's on that Restream network, and it's on YouTube, and I think he's got it on Facebook now. But we've been doing that. My good friend Pat Trammell, who used to promote wrestling down in Oxford and Talladega and over in Bowden, Georgia, and down that little corridor. And even when he was in college, he promoted some shows, is with us. And a coach out of Arkansas who was probably Jonesboro, Arkansas's biggest fan back in the day, joins us. And we have a topic every week about Memphis wrestling. And right now we're in a series that they're doing about favorite moments of Memphis wrestling. And I was a wrestling fan I was born and raised in Huntsville. When Huntsville, Alabama had the first cable television system in this part of the country. And it was not cable as we know it now, but it was a cable coming into your house that carried all the outside area TV stations. They had a tower up on Mount Asano Mountain up by the Burritt Museum, and it had 4 antennas on it. And one antenna picked up Birmingham, and one picked up Chattanooga, one picked up Nashville, and one picked up West, which you would get. Sometimes you'd get Columbus, Mississippi. Sometimes you'd get Channel 15 in Florence, and you would get Memphis. You'd see Channel 13. And whoever programmed it on Saturday mornings at one time for about a 3-year stretch while I was in high school, I'd see 4 wrestling shows on a Saturday. I'd see the 4 o'clock show with Grady Reeves at Channel 19. I'd see the 5 o'clock show, which was taped earlier at Channel 12 in Chattanooga. I would see Channel 42 and Sterling Brewer in Birmingham, and I could flip over to Channel 8 in Nashville, which is now Channel 2, and watch Jack Simpson and Jack Simpson, Smiling Jack Simpson, and Gil Green. So you had that, and then every now and then they'd flip the Memphis show on in the middle of the day. If a baseball game was on and they had to cover it up, they'd put Memphis Wrestling on out of Memphis. So I'd get to see the early days of Lance and Dave on Channel 13. I got to see Jack Simpson and Gil Green in Nashville. I got to see Harry Thornton in Chattanooga. I got to see Grady Reeves in Huntsville. I got to see Sterling Brewer in Birmingham. So I was hooked on it. I mean, the announcers made those shows. They were local, and some of them were just, you wouldn't see them doing anything else on TV but wrestling. But they knew how to get it over, and that's sort of what caught me the bug. And my Uncle John, my godfather, we lived on Walker Street in Huntsville, and back then Nick Gulas had wrestling on Friday nights on Patton Street at the Patton Street Armory, which is now the Child Advocacy Center. And Uncle John would take me to the matches half a block away. I mean, walk to the matches, and people that were going to matches would park in our front yard. And so, that sort of got me going when I was very young. And that's sort of how I got into it. But those commentators, they were what it was all about. They sold it.
Randy?
You just talked me through my childhood, but I was on the other end of the state. So I got John Casana from Knoxville, Bob Cottle from Mid-Atlantic, and of course, Harry Thornton out of Chattanooga. And that kind of leads me to my question. Gulas Welch as a promotion was so smart to attach those local announcers as co-promoters. Tell us what those guys like Sterling Brewer and Harry Thornton, especially for me, I grew up worse, meant to Gulas Welch wrestling.
Well, you're absolutely right. And Roy Welch, I didn't get to know Roy because he was already in a nursing home when I started with Nick. And but I heard a lot of stories, and I heard a lot of them from Nick, and I heard some of them from Tojo and Jackie Fargo, and Roy was the guy that got the wrestlers and the wrestling. He was the mastermind behind the angles and the people they brought in and who they pushed and whatever. Nick was a showman. No, Nick was P.T. Barnum, and Nick was a businessman, and he was smart enough, like you said. You hit the nail on the head. He had Joe Denenberg in Birmingham that ran the jewelry store down there, and a loan company, and he had Harry Thornton, which had part of the promotion, had 10% of Chattanooga. He had Grady Reeves, who did a popular show in Huntsville called Morning Folks on Channel 19 for years. And they talk about wrestling. And when people would see him on the street, they may talk about the morning show of Harry Thornton in Chattanooga, and they'd say they know him from there, but they talk to him about wrestling.
Absolutely.
And then that was the thing. Sterling Brewer was an advertising agent, had his own advertising agency in Birmingham. And, that's sort of how that all came about. Lance Russell was the program director at Channel 13 in Memphis, WHBQ TV, and Dave Brown was a DJ on WHBQ Radio, 560 AM, that he talked into being on the TV with him. And then Dave became a part-time weatherman, then a full-time weatherman, and then, that's the greatest team in the history of announcing. So, I like you, I had the opportunity to expose it. But Harry Thornton, I'll never forget. He'd always call me kid. And I'll never forget the first time I met him. He looked at me and he said, "I've seen some of your some of the Nashville shows." And I would, "Yes, sir, Mr. Thornton." He said, "You may make it, kid. You may make it." And he wouldn't come out and just say something nice, but he wouldn't be mad or rude. But the thing that Nick didn't like about Harry, and he always told me, he said, "Don't do what Harry does when he's interviewing the wrestlers." He said, because Harry fights back with him. They'll say something, and then Harry would say, "Well, you're lying about that," or he would clash with him. And Nick said that took the heat off of him.
Yeah.
Harry's trying to get heat on himself, and he said that took the heat off of me. That cooled down the heat. He said, "Don't do that." He said, "Ask him a question and shut up." Well, okay, man, I'm good at that. Back then, I was better at shutting up than I am now. That was Harry was, but the man I think I learned my most lessons for was a guy that you guys may or may not have known. If you find the black and white tapes, you'll see what I'm talking about. Was a guy named Smiling Jack Simpson. He was the commentator for Nick Lewis in Nashville, and he got the nickname Smiling Jack Simpson because he never smiled, and he was very deadpan. But he could get over on it. You listen to his commentary on the match, would call a hole, but he would sort of. He had that ebb and flow of knowing when to get excited and when it was headed to the finish. And he had that science about him. He had that feel of the match, and watching him and learning from him sort of gave me my style, I guess you might say.
I'll go to Jeremy, but you said something. We could do an hour on Georgia Championships All-Stars that recorded here, and that 4 weeks was, if you can find those tapes, our friend Pat Rose was involved in that promotion.
Great guy, one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. And
go ahead.
If I could, I didn't get the rest of the question.
No, you have the chance. We'll come back and we'll talk about that limited experiment, because that intrigues me, that so much talent was there that never came to fruition. What?
But some of that, I think, and if you want to do another show somewhere down the line, we can definitely do that about those days. And that was a great experiment that had all the makings of success. And Ole Anderson, God rest his soul, one of the most cantankerous people I'd ever met, then called Memphis Wrestling the shits. He said it's the shits. They're a bunch of hillbillies. He was not kind and never thought nice about Memphis wrestling. Just quickly on Ole, and I know I'm getting off track and I'm holding you guys up too, but I had a chance to work with Ole on a show that Ronnie West, the referee that lived in Chattanooga and worked for Nick and worked for Georgia Championship for many years. Anyway, I had a chance to work with Ole in about, I think this is about 2010, 2011, maybe 2010. In Cleveland, Tennessee on a Saturday night. And his wife brought him there, and Ronnie West had convinced him to do the show with me. And we started out, and he didn't remember me, thank God, from that 4 weeks. And we got to the intermission, and he was on a walker at the time. And he looked at me. He said, "It sucks getting old." And I said, "Well," "we all get there sometime." And he looked at me and he said, "I didn't think I was going to like doing this." He said, "But I like you. You're pretty good at this." And he walked off. The whole show was over. He came back. We finished the show. I waited till the show was over, and he told his wife to go out out to the car and get a book out of the trunk. And I've still got it. He autographed it to me. He said something very nice to me. And at the end of it all, we were about to leave, and I walked him out to the car, and I said, "I want to recall something to you, Ole." I said, "You and I have actually met before." And he said, "Really?" And I told him, "Where?" And he said, he shook his head. He got in the car and he said, "Boy, I sure am glad I didn't know that before we started." But he had a smile on his face when he said it. And then I did have a chance a couple of times to talk with him after that. And I'll tell you, we've lost this year in the professional wrestling ranks. Losing somebody like Anderson. Mike Mooneyham over in Charleston is doing a great series on Sundays in the newspaper over there about Ole. I think this is chapter 10 tomorrow. But Ole was one of the most cantankerous, out of sorts, but he was a tell it like it is. He was truthful. And what you saw was what you got. And I can work with that. I can understand that, and I can get along with that. There are a lot of boys that couldn't. But Ole was a genius in our business.
Jeremy, I'll hand you up.
Yeah, I could, I can work with that as well, Michael. You get to a certain point in life, you just like for people you like to know where they stand and where you stand with them and everything. So you mentioned Harry Thornton, and for me, I lived on the northern part of Sand Mountain there in the Higdon areas where I grew up. So we only had really TV wise, we only had three choices. We had Channel 3, Channel 9, and Channel 12. So my first remembrance of professional wrestling as a kid was Harry Thornton in that Channel 12 studio. And so we had a neighbor that lived behind our property, and strange character. I'll put it that way. And they called him Slewfoot. And he wore bib overalls every day. And I can remember one morning sitting in the living room watching that TV program on Channel 12. And, you saw Tojo. I mean, the whole list. I think Tommy Rich, different people, came in. And I can remember this guy got really excited. And, you could see the audience on the other side of the ring. And I look up, and I get closer to the TV, and I'm like, my God, it's my neighbor, it's Slewfoot, and he's trying to get in. He's trying to get in the ring. I mean, he believed it. It was real, and he was ready to fight. And I'll never forget that experience. And Harry Thornton and his voice. My question is just simply this, and working with Jerry Jarrett. Where do you think Jerry Jarrett ranks as a promoter in the history of professional wrestling?
Well, first of all, I think he's very underrated because he, toward the end of his wrestling promotion career, he ended up with buying out Fritz and basically trying to save him from going under. He created TNA, which was a fabulous idea that just too many cooks spoil the soup. And I think that soured Jerry, and that's why he got out of it. But I think as far as wrestling promoters that I have known or worked with, he's definitely top three without a doubt. I think Sam Munchnick, and I had the opportunity to have lunch with Sam a couple of times in St. Louis 2 years before he passed. He was 90 years old. And he ate at a little meat and three over in Clayton, where the radio station was close by. And a mutual friend, put us together one day where we were going to do a 45-minute lunch. We ended up lasting 3 hours. And then the next week, he wanted me to come over to his condo. And his condo, it walked in, it was like a museum, but it was a pack rats museum. He had clippings, he had pictures, and you talk about a man with stories. Once he got to know you and realized that you were in the business or had a love for the business, he was just a phenomenal man. And and knowing and reading a lot about Sam and getting to know and talking to boys and working with people like Harley that worked with him, and Bob Geigel and Paul Bosch and some of the people I got the honor to meet, and Eddie Graham and all. I just really felt that I think he was the greatest promoter of all time, because what he did, and I know you guys probably know the story, in 1947, he was the front man for the St. Louis Browns, and the Browns moved to Baltimore, and he lost his job. But he knew the wrestling promoter in St. Louis, and whose name I can't recall. And the guy asked him to come over and do a story about his wrestling, and because he was looking for stories to do, because he wasn't the Browns stringer anymore. And he went over and did it. And after he wrote the story, he went back to the promoter and basically told him, if he didn't cut him in on the action. He wanted to help him promote wrestling, and ultimately took over promoting wrestling. He was going to expose the business. And the guy panicked and ended up giving Sam half the territory. And the guy died like 6 months later, and Sam ended up with the whole thing. So then he blackmailed the 27 other promoters, because he's a writer for one of the top 10 newspapers in America that time, the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. And he said, if we don't all work together and work as a unit and a team, I'm going to write an expose and it'll get picked up by every paper in America and the business will be dead. So they were like, whoa. And they made him president of the NWA. That's how the NWA formed. But he was a phenomenal promoter. But in doing that, the only thing that he wanted one world champion. And Sam told me this directly. He said, everybody had their own champions and nobody knew who to believe. He said, and it was just chaos. He said, but I convinced him that if we had one world champion that was the National Wrestling Alliance world champion, and they all share in the pot, we all would make more money. And sure enough, that's what happened. And then that's how the NWA title was born from back in the days. They trace it back to Jim Londos and forward from that. But Whipper Billy Watson and Pat O'Connor and Buddy Rogers and Luthez and all those guys were controlled by Sam Munchnick. So anyway, so you asked this question, I gave you another answer, but yeah, I would.
It's okay. We love it.
I work for Nick Gulas, and you get a lot of negative on Nick. Nick got a lot of heat on himself, but back in the day, but Nick was nothing but good to me. I saw him do things for the boys that other promoters probably would not have done. It's a tough customer to work for because he wanted it his way or the highway. But my favorite Nick Gulas story, and I tell it all the time. I had a little boy. I had a 4, and my wife got pregnant, and we had a baby in Nashville. We had a little girl, and when Jamie was born, my wife had a cesarean the first time around, so we had to have a cesarean, which meant a surgery. And I had insurance, but the insurance was not all that great. And anyway, I ended up owing some money to the hospital. And George Gulas and I, we did a lot of these wrestling, and we did the Kicks 104 Dirty Dribblers basketball team. We go to a high school to raise money. We play their teams, we play whatever, and raise money. And George was doing wrestling shows, so we decided to pool the talent and make bigger shows, which we did for about 2.5 years. But I was at a show down in at Taft Correctional Institute in Tennessee, and shortly after Jamie was born, and Mr. Nick paid me, and I walked off. I told George, I said, yeah, I said I really can use these. I said, this is really helping because I got to pay off my bill at the hospital. Well, the following Friday, that was like on a Tuesday night, that Friday, I get a call out in Gallatin, and the secretary comes in and says, Michael, Mr. Gulas is on the Nick Gulas is on the phone. It's okay. So I pick it up. He said, hey, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm at work. He said, you coming to Nashville today? I said, well, I wasn't planning on it, but if you need me, I can. He said, I need to see you. He hung up the phone. No goodbye, no anything. So I'm like, oh shit, what did I do? Am I losing my job? What's going on? So I go down to the office on 8th Avenue, and he had a 2-story building. The bottom was actually underground, and he had a wrestling ring set up in there, and that's how he'd audition some of the talent. But anyway, I go in, and the girl at the desk tells me, says, yeah, Mr. Nick wants to see you. I was waiting to see you. Go on in. Well, I go in, he's sitting there with George, and he had an office. It was a long office. He had this big wooden desk at the back of the office. And the NWA logo that they used on TV, that art card, was behind his desk. So it was sort of a ominous kind of office. So I walked in there, and as I'm walking in, George walks out. I'm like, oh, shit, this ain't good. So I sit down, and he looks at me, and he says, Michael, I want you to be 100% truthful to me. No matter what I ask, I want you to be honest to me. And I said, Mr. Gulas, I'm always honest to you. I have no reason not to be. He says, do you owe anybody any money? And I'm like, no, because I'm thinking, all right, he's thinking I'm gambling or, something's going on. I looked at him and said, no, I don't know. He said, I said, tell me the truth. Do you owe anybody any money? He's coming across the desk, and I'm like, well, Mr. Goulis, I've got some small debts. I pay my monthly bills every month. I said, and I'm not behind. I said, the only thing that I've had come up new is I'm paying off Nashville Memorial Hospital from Jamie being born there. I said, but I'm paying him $100 a month and paying him off. He looks at me. He said, how much do you owe them? And I'm like, okay. I said, well, I owe him $1,000, which was true. I said, I owe him $1,000 and I'll have it paid off by the end of the year. He said, that's all you owe? I said, yes, sir. He reaches in, he opens his desk drawer, and he pulls out a wad of money. Now, Nick used to carry a wad of $100 bills in his wallet or in his pocket, in his front right pocket. He pulls out this wad of $100 bills, looks like a softball, and he starts counting them off, and he counts 10 of them off, and he pushes them across the desk. He said, you go right now and you pay that bill. And I was like, okay, Mr. Goulis, thank you, but I'll pay you this loan back. He says, just go pay the bill and bring me the receipt that you paid it. I said, yes, sir. So I went, sure enough, left his office, drove to National Memorial Hospital, went to the business office. I said, I want to pay the bill, paid him the money Nick gave me, got the receipt. And anyway, the following Wednesday night, the first thing I did, I looked him up and gave him the receipt. I said, now you take out this money of what you pay me every week until I pay you back. He said, don't worry about it. And he walked off. Never heard another word about it. Ever heard a word about it. Not only did I never hear a word about it, he never took a dime out of anything. He still paid everything he paid me. Never took a dime. So people can say what they want to say about Nick Goulis, but I know Nick Goulis. And Nick Goulis was a good man. And he didn't have to do that. And I don't know what motivated him to do it, but I'm thankful to this day that he did.
Wow. Wow.
I grew up in a time where I would go to Goulis Welch Wrestling every Saturday night at the Memorial Auditorium, and it never failed. Nick would be in that front lobby, and his whole goal of everybody in that front lobby is to get you in the building and get you in your seat and get the show started. And that's great to hear, because you hear a lot of bad things about Nick Goulis, but I love wrestling because of Goulis Welch promotion. There was no Goulis Welch without Nick Goulis here in Chattanooga. So that's very, very good to hear. That made my day. Thank you.
Well, that's more of a personal story, but it's a true one. And you're right. He was good. And I wish I'd have known Roy Welch, because the boys that worked with Roy and the older boys, the other guys, they used to say that he was a shoot wrestler before he became a pro wrestler. And he trained Dr. D, David Schultz, who I got to know, and he almost killed a kid before he let him out of the barn over in West Tennessee. But between Roy and Herb Welch, they'd make you or break you.
Well, Michael, we appreciate you coming on. Sorry we kept you so long.
No, it's fine. I owed it to you. I'm sorry I punted last week, and I apologize for being late this week. But thank you for the opportunity. If you want to do, holler at me. I love talking wrestling with you guys.
The only thing that you said that we want to change real quick is if we want to have you back. It's not if, it's when we have you back. We want to have you back.
Anytime except during high school football season. That, give me a call.
We know what that's like.
God bless you guys. Thank you for the opportunity.
You have 4 high school football announcers on this podcast, and we didn't say a word about high school football.
We can do that on another podcast.
There you go.
Absolutely. Michael, we appreciate the time. Sorry we kept you so long. Looking forward to having you back as soon as possible. And, appreciate you being candid with us and telling us these personal stories that a lot of other people may have not even known about.
Well, glad to do it. Enjoyed it. And God bless you. Let's do it again.
Oh, absolutely.
Michael, real quick, tell us where we can find tell the folks that will hear this, where they can find your podcast that you mentioned earlier.
The easiest one is Randy Hales. Randy Hales has a site on YouTube, It's I think it's Randy H. Hale, and the one that's quickest to go to. We're on that Restream network, but I have no idea. All I know is they send me a link. I click on it. It's on the computer here at the house, and then I start talking. But we're also on Twitter. I know that you can follow Randy Hales on Twitter, and it's a live feed on that Twitter live thing or whatever it is now. But those are the two best sources, and it's Central. It's 7 o'clock till 9 o'clock on Tuesday nights Central Time, and we talk a lot. If you like Memphis wrestling, we talk Memphis wrestling 80% of the time, and we bullshit the rest of the time.
Great. Once again, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We enjoyed having you on here. We will have you back again as soon as possible. Just like you already know, we're all football people, so our football season's covered up as well, just like yours is. Go ahead and give a shout out to your radio station as well.
Well, I've got a few of them. I got Fun 92.7 FM, which has 8 counties in North Alabama. I've got WRAB 107.1 FM, which is classic country and the home of the Brewer Patriots. Arab football is on 92.7, as is the Alabama Crimson Tide. We have Fun 92.7 HD2 now, which is the live home of the Fife Red Devils, beside it being on the Red Devil Radio Network. And Papa Adam, as I can now call him, Adam West, 4-time state national or state Alabama Association of Broadcasters Sportscaster of the Year, probably one of the best sportscasters not doing NFL games in the country today. Then we have 104.9 in Decatur, which is our WAFN AM's translator, and it is the home of the Priceville Bulldogs. And then we have 93.5 and 93.9 FM WTNK in Hartsville, Tennessee, home of the 9-time state champion Trousdale County Yellow Jackets. And their announcer's name is Cheese, and don't get into asking me how. But football with cheese just does not make an appetizing ring to my palate. But anyway, he does a good job, and that's a really great program. And those are the stations where classic hits on all of them at WRAB, and we have a lot of fun doing it. The business modicum is do the right thing and have fun doing it. And we've been doing it for going on 28 years at the end of this month. So glad to do it, and have no idea of when or where to retire unless the Lord tells me I need to.
Sounds great, Michael. We appreciate you being on once again. For everybody who's watching us, we're on YouTube as well. We're on X, Twitter, whichever one you want to call it, Facebook and all that. Go follow us, like, subscribe. We've already got Michael saying that he's going to come back on here very soon, so be looking for that here in the near future. We'll try to get one more in if it's all right with you before football starts.
Let's do it.
Man, there's so many more questions that I know I've got to ask, and I'm sure that Randy's got several and Jeremy's got several as well. But Michael, thanks for joining us again. Fantastic show. Appreciate you being on. So for myself, Jeremy Johnson, Randy Cunningham, and for one Alabama Broadcaster Hall of Famer, Mr. Michael St. John, Howard Chaney saying good night and God bless.
Good night, everybody.